Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Patricia Rosenmeyer. I'm the faculty director of the Carolina Center for Jewish Studies, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this year's Sylvia and Irving Margolis Lecture on the Jewish Experience in the American South. This lectureship was made possible by generous gifts from Alan and Gail Fields and Gary and Sandra Smiley in honor of Gail and Sandra's parents, who are longtime residents of Williamston, North Carolina. Their father, Irving Margolis, co-owned and ran a clothing business for 52 years. Their father, their mother, Sylvia Levy Margolis, was a woman of valor in her small town. She was the driving force behind integrating the Williamston Library in the 1960s so that Black children could check out books alongside their white peers. She was president of the North Carolina Association of Jewish Women and one of the founders of the North Carolina Jewish Home for the Aged. And our lecture tonight honors both Sylvia and Irving and their identity, specifically as Southern Jews. I'd also briefly like to acknowledge Gary Smiley's untimely passing last month and dedicate this lecture in his memory, and may his memory be for a blessing. We're honored to have Professor Shari Rabin with us tonight. Professor Rabin is a scholar working at the intersection of Jewish studies, religious studies, and American history. She has a BA from Boston University and a PhD in religious studies from Yale, and she's currently Associate Professor of Jewish Studies, Religion, and History at Oberlin College, as well as chair of the Jewish Studies program there. Having grown up in Georgia, she keeps close connections with the South in her professional role as vice president of the Southern Jewish Historical Society. And previous to her time in the Midwest, she was assistant professor of Jewish studies and director of the Pearlstein Lipov Center for Southern Jewish Culture at the College of Charleston. Professor Rabin's first book, Jews on the Frontier, Religion and Mobility in 19th Century America, which came out in 2017, just 2 years after her PhD, was the winner of the National Jewish Book Award in American Jewish Studies. Her second book, The Jewish South, An American History, was published just this year by Princeton, and it's the first narrative survey of Southern Jewish history. It explores dynamics of race, religion, and it features a wide range of Jewish Southerners whose stories complicate popular understandings of their region. In tonight's presentation, Professor Rabin will discuss the process of writing her book and share some of the most intriguing finds from her research. This presentation is co-sponsored, and we're very grateful for that, by the Center for the Study of the American South and the Department of American Studies. We'll have a period for questions at the end, and I'll ask you to use the microphone that I'll bring around so we can all hear. But now please join me in welcoming Professor Rabin, who will speak to us on the Jewish South, New Histories.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out. It's great to see you all, great to see so many students. Thank you to everybody who helped make this visit possible, and for all the co-sponsors. I actually gave this lecture, I looked it up, it was 2019, right when I had first started writing this book, so it's a little bit full circle to come back now, having finished the book, and it's always lovely to come back to Chapel Hill. So, in his 1941 classic, The Mind of the South, journalist W.J. Cash wrote, "The Jew, with his universal refusal to be assimilated, is everywhere the eternal alien. And in the South, where any difference had always stood out with great vividness, he was especially so." Of course, in 1941, Cash was writing in a particular moment in the shadow of Nazi anti-Semitism, but I think his remarks here, his thoughts here also speak to a more persistent assumption that the South is a place utterly inhospitable to Jews. This assumption has to do with how people think about the South as agricultural, as Protestant, and how they think about Jews as necessarily urban, industrial, and Northern. My research has long been focused on the nature and significance of Jewish life outside of New York City and in more unexpected places. And in this new book, I was interested in interrogating the nature of the South by looking through the eyes of its Jewish residents, who it turns out have been present, and not only as eternal aliens, for centuries. I came to this work because of my own personal history in the region, including 4 years that I spent working in Charleston. This is an action shot of me in the historic cemetery that we'll return to in a little bit. I hosted a NEH Summer Institute there, which Marcy Cohen-Ferris was part of. So I spent these years in Charleston. I also really benefited from decades of scholarship in Southern Jewish history, dating back to a book some of you might know. Eli Evans' The Provincials sort of inaugurated the study of Southern Jewish history in its modern era. So there's been many scholars working on little pieces of the puzzle for many, many decades, and I was able to benefit from their work. I also tried to read contextually, to read works in Southern history, in modern Jewish history, and then I also conducted a considerable amount of original research, some of which I'm going to share today, and which I think is where a lot of the most exciting stuff happened. So my plans, quick tour of kind of greatest hits, the moments and sources that I think are the most significant and interesting. This history, there's a number of different ways you can begin this history, but kind of one way to begin it is in 1492 with the expulsion of Jews and Muslims from Spain. Jews who had converted to Catholicism were among the earliest Spanish settlers in the Americas, but their identities were submerged. Jews were not allowed in Catholic territories in the Americas at all. Jews had also been expelled from England in 1290. But in the 1650s, they began to allow Jews to settle, or Jews kind of showed up and began to settle, without an invitation, in English colonies in the Caribbean. You start to see Jewish settlers in Barbados. There's a big discussion around this time as well in England about readmitting Jews to England proper, and they sort of are tacitly allowed in after a big public debate. So Jews are starting to arrive in these English colonies. And this is the context for a document that I really became obsessed with early on when I got to Charleston. It's called the Fundamental Constitutions of Carolina. It was a planning document for the Carolina colony. It was co-authored by a young John Locke. Yes, that John Locke, the philosopher. And it kind of lays out their vision of the colony. And I'm going to read you a line, which I first heard recited by tour guides in the historic synagogue in Charleston. And it's a line that always elicited chuckles. So if you feel inclined to chuckle, you're welcome to, but not a requirement. Since it will not be reasonable for us to keep Jews, heathens, and other dissenters, that was the laugh line, Jews, heathens, and other dissenters, from the purity of Christian religion, any 7 or more persons agreeing in any religion shall constitute a church or profession. So this is, has typically been talked about as, a rolling out of the red carpet, a welcome to Jews, often, showing that like South Carolina has always been a welcoming place. And it is offering a welcome. It is very notable that it's imagining a Jewish presence in this colony that hasn't even been settled yet. That is notable. But I also really see an ambivalence here. And when you look at this line, when I heard it from tour guides, it was only Jews, heathens, and other dissenters. And I just gave you a little bit here, but when you zoom out to the section of this Fundamental Constitutions, you see that the section actually shows Jews in a weird position, because it starts by talking about, on the one hand, indigenous quote unquote heathens. And on the other hand, it talks about Protestant dissenters. It talks about them in slightly different ways. It's sort of, you shouldn't treat the native peoples badly, and these people with different opinions are going to expect toleration. So it sets out 2 clear categories of non-Anglicans, because this is going to be an Anglican colony. And so then all of a sudden Jews are kind of thrown into the mix out of nowhere, and it's not clear where do they lie. Are they closer to the heathens, or are they closer to other dissenters? There's other writings from Locke where he seems to think that Jews are in a very different category than like Baptists or Quakers, for instance. So it's speaking to sort of an uncertainty about where Jews lie. And this document more broadly, a number of historians have been working on it recently because it really shows some of these processes in this period of trying to define religion as a category that's separated out from social status. This is a period where you're seeing Christian being crossed out in certain legal codes and replaced with white in order to exclude Black and Indigenous Christians. That move to shift from Christian to white also has this effect of including European Jews. So in this kind of colonial maelstrom of these different peoples coming together, you see this sort of inclusion, but I think somewhat ambivalent. So this is 1669. We start to get the first records of Jews present in the Carolina colony in the 1690s. And within a century, there are Jewish communities in Charleston and in Savannah. And Savannah, it comes as a group. There's a group settlement of Jews who arrive in 1733. In Charleston, it's more of a trickle starting in the 1690s. In Carolina, these Jewish settlers tended to be seen as white dissenters, as closer to Huguenots and Baptists and the like. They participated in land ownership and in slavery, which were part and parcel of white settler behavior and status at the time. But they were occasionally excluded or denigrated in ways that marked them as different, in a different way than Protestant dissenters were different. There were moments where Jews were marked as more different. In Charleston, there's a congregation established in 1749, and then eventually the Jewish cemetery that you see me in here, the Cumming Street Cemetery, which you can go visit in downtown Charleston. You know, I like cemeteries, and I you know, include them sort of throughout the book because gravestones within cemeteries are a really important vehicle of marking Jewish history and identity. Gravestones document familial and communal values, histories of migration. It's a really rich and important source, especially in historical eras where there's less documentation. And so when I was beginning the research on this book, I knew that I had to go to the cemetery, and I said, okay, what was the earliest gravestone in the cemetery? I'm going to start there and see what I can find out. This is the cemetery. This is the gravestone that it turns out is the oldest one in the cemetery. It is from 1762. It's a large box tomb, which itself indicates that Jews had accumulated the resources to claim space and to create, you know, sizable monuments in this time and place. Boop. And it belongs to a man named Moses Cohen, who was the first religious leader of Charleston's Jewish congregation. He was almost certainly a migrant to the city from elsewhere in the Atlantic world. He was almost certainly not actually an ordained rabbi of any kind, but just a knowledgeable layperson who could lead services and the like. And you know, this gravestone, I really dug into it and found it to be a really useful way of thinking about the place of Jews in Charleston. In many ways, we can see in this gravestone that they are like their co-religionists elsewhere in the Jewish Atlantic world. So I did a little comparison. This is a gravestone from Bridgetown, Barbados, and you can see both of them have the imagery of the hands. They're in the position of the priestly benediction, and Cohen is a last name associated with descendants of the priestly lineage. So this is indicating sort of membership in this Jewish group. But it also, I think, shows the development of a Jewish religious ethos that's steeped in the local setting, right? So there's some similarities here with Barbados, but there's also some interesting differences. And when I looked at other gravestones of non-Jewish Charlestonians, I also found some similarities. This was like a aha moment when I found this gravestone on the right and was looking at my Moses Cohen gravestone. I was like, oh my gosh, like it's the same, right? They both have. Oh, I think I have Yes, there we go, right? It has this kind of wreath circle, and it's very decorative, just like this is a Christian minister in Charleston from the following year. So it's adopting this local style, which it turns out is called a portrait gravestone, which was very common in Charleston in this period. So they're bringing together this kind of Charleston medium with Jewish content, right? Instead of the face of the deceased, it's their hands in the priestly benediction. You can also see some of this in the text. Thank you to the rabbi who transcribed this in the 1960s very helpfully. So it's in Hebrew and English. The one from Bridgetown, Barbados is primarily in Portuguese and Hebrew with like a little bit of English. Here it's only English and Hebrew, which shows, I think, also perhaps some more acculturation in the local place. My favorite part about this, there's a lot of things you can say about these poems, the translations. The poem talks to the deceased person. It uses the second person, which is interesting. But my favorite part here is right here. Lieth interred the Right Reverend Moses Cohen, D.D. It turns out that is specific honorifics associated with the Church of England. This man did not have a doctor of divinity, right? But they're trying to signal to their Christian neighbors, this is a man with status. Like, this is our equivalent to, for Charlestonian Anglicans, it would have been the Bishop of London. Saying, Bishop of London, this guy, Moses Cohen, same. Yeah, so they're really steeping themselves in the local context. They're insisting on their Jewishness, but also kind of clearly aligning themselves with their white Protestant neighbors. So this is a little colonial interlude. I want to talk next about the Civil War. So we had these Jews coming in the 18th century, initially mostly Spanish and Portuguese Jews, more Central European Jews coming by the end of the 18th century. So by the time of the Civil War, there were families, Jewish families who'd been present in the region for decades. And also a lot of newer arrivals from Central Europe. There'd been mass migrations from German-speaking lands in the 1840s and 1850s. White Jews were enslavers. They profited from slavery. Jews did tend to be urban merchants. Only a very, very small number of Jews owned plantations that we think about when we think of like the Old South and slavery. But they seem to have had no qualms about fully participating as white citizens and business people in this key aspect of Southern white life. This also meant that there were Jews who were enthusiastic Confederates, most famously perhaps Judah P. Benjamin, who was Secretary of State of the Confederacy, although he really distanced himself from his Jewish past in his professional career. He married a Catholic woman. He did not join a synagogue. He was trying to sort of stay away from that. But also ordinary people like these brothers, the Moses brothers of Charleston, who were all born in South Carolina to parents who were born in South Carolina. Their father was a man named Andrew Jackson Moses, if that tells you anything. One of them, Joshua, standing there at the top, he was killed in battle and buried in Mobile. He was eulogized by a young woman acquaintance as poor Josh Moses, the flower of our circle, a noble man, another martyr to our glorious cause. So men and women fully participating, embracing the Confederacy. After the war as well, you kind of see here that our glorious cause kind of inklings of what's going to become the lost cause devotion in the decades after the Civil War. And there were Jews who were also enthusiastic participants in this. In interesting cases in Richmond, there was a group of Jewish women who got together and created a Confederate Jewish cemetery. You can still go visit it in Richmond. They actually mention when they established this, there's this society to care for these Confederate Jewish gravestones. They say that they're doing it, out of Confederate pride, but also so that if people, question their loyalty, they can point to this cemetery and say, "Look, we were part of it." So they have the same reasons as other white Southern women, but they also have this kind of self-consciousness of are people going to be accusing us of disloyalty as Jews, which some did, especially in the second half of the Civil War. There were quite a few moments of anti-Semitism as the war went worse and worse for the Confederacy. Among the women who participated in the Lost Cause after the war was these guys' mom, not surprising perhaps. Here she is later in life, Octavia Harby Moses. She lived till 1904, and her obituary in 1904, this is what it says. Mrs. Octavia Harby Moses dead. The first Confederate monument was raised through her efforts. So she's being identified in the local newspaper for her efforts in working towards Confederate memorialization. That's what she's known for when she dies. Many historians have kind of sort of assumed that this approach, this embrace of the Confederacy and the Lost Cause was universal among Southern Jews. There's a famous book called The Jewish Confederates, and a lot of historians have said, you know, Jews went with their region. They say this in part to push back against accusations of disloyalty, to say, oh, Jews are not, you know, disloyal. They were loyal to the region that they lived in. But actually, one of the most interesting things I found in the research for this book was evidence of Jews who were not quite as enthusiastic about the secession and the Confederacy. And I found this because I had a student researcher. I gave her a list of names of Jewish people that I was tracking in other chapters. And I said, okay, go to Ancestry.com, go to Folds3.com, and just look for these names, just to like see what I've missed, see what's out there. And it turns out that a number of the Jewish people that I'd been tracking had written letters after the Civil War to President Andrew Johnson, a particular kind of letter called an amnesty petition. And basically what happened is that President Johnson gave a general amnesty to Southerners, right? Okay, the war's over. We're not going to, you know, accuse you all of treason and try to imprison all of you and punish you. We're going to give a general amnesty. But there were certain categories of people, including those who had a certain amount of wealth, who did not get automatic amnesty. They had to write a letter to request it. He was very like fast and loose with it. He was not strict about it. I've found one letter from a Jewish Confederate supporter who basically just said, yeah, I'm from South Carolina. I'm a South Carolinian. I supported secession. And he, you know, got his citizenship back. It wasn't a problem. But in these documents, I also found amongst these letters, Jews who expressed that they had not been so enthusiastic, that they could not really be called Jewish Confederates in a very strong way. One of these letters is written by a woman named Rosanna Osterman. She was a German-speaking immigrant who went to Texas in the 1830s and was heavily involved in creating Jewish institutions in Galveston. She helped establish its first Jewish burial ground in 1852. She actually died a year after that, and she had a very generous will that gave money to local non-Jewish causes, to Jewish causes in other parts of the country. Very interesting cosmopolitan woman. And so here's her signature, and here's the text of her letter to Andrew Johnson. Written September 1865. I have always been opposed to secession and opposed to the war, have never contributed $1 for the promotion nor prosecution of the late war. And could my hopes, prayers, and wishes have been realized, no disruption between the North and South would ever have taken place, as I always felt not only satisfied, but happy in the enjoyments of living under the United States government. So she's saying, I was not really into this war. She says elsewhere in the letter, you know, I had dependents and financial assets in Galveston. I didn't feel like it was possible for me to leave. But yeah, you can't readily call her an enthusiastic Jewish Confederate. She was suspicious and ambivalent, to say the least, if not, you know, opposed. She says, you know, I was opposed to secession. And, you know, to say this is just to say that Jews were like other Southerners. A lot of scholars have showed that loyalties could be complex, could be shifting. There was a lot of reasons to doubt the project of secession and the Confederacy. You know, there's a lot of reasons for Jews and non-Jews alike. It's also worth noting that she's not saying I was always opposed to slavery. She's saying I was opposed to secession. So, you know, that's the context here. But it's still notable in pushing back against an idea of a kind of monolithic Jewish political position. So this period of the second founding after the Civil War also saw the establishment of courts of claims, the Southern Claims Commission, which rewarded Southerners who had remained loyal to the Union. You also see the establishment of the Freedmen's Bureau, which worked to help newly emancipated citizens. And as white Southern violence kind of spiked in this post-war period, and the Ku Klux Klan was established, there were congressional hearings on its activities, which is just to say that there was also all sorts of government activity, government documentation happening in this period. And Jews are present throughout the records that resulted from these efforts as former owners of enslaved people, as government contractors, as victims of Klan violence. There were 3 Jewish merchants who were murdered by the Klan in the 1870s and who appear in the congressional hearing records, and as self-described loyal Unionists trying to get reimbursed for goods confiscated by the Union Army. Amidst the maelstrom of violent Reconstruction politics, most Jews would ally with the then white supremacist Democratic Party. Some of them would serve as Democratic politicians, but there was also a number who supported the Republican Party and served in elected offices as Republicans. Jews were, as they had been during the Civil War, politically active, but also politically divided. Interestingly, Jewish politicians of both parties, despite their bitter disagreements, remained in the same Jewish communities. In 1873, the Union of American Hebrew Congregations was created. It was a sort of national Jewish institution that would become the center of American Reform Judaism. In American Jewish history, that's sort of part and parcel of talking about the 1870s in American Jewish life. It's seen as a period of flourishing and prosperity and institutionalization, and it is. But when you read this Southern historiography from the 1870s, it feels like it's on a totally separate planet. Like, did these even exist in the same universe? And they did. And it turns out that Southern Jews of all political stripes did embrace Reform Judaism and supported the Union. And the earliest records of the Union of American Hebrew Congregations include letters of support from both a Jewish Democratic mayor of Alexandria, Louisiana, and from a Jewish Republican state legislature from Little Rock, Arkansas. So there were political disagreements, but they were still within the same institutions. Which is notable in part because that was not at all the case among American Christians. The Southern Baptists are still separate because of political debates over slavery in the antebellum period. Jews are different in interesting ways. In the decades to come, Southern Jews would become increasingly acculturated, but they would also be joined by a wave of Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe who were more visibly distinct. As a fellow Jew trying to help them wrote, this is somebody trying to help them, their garb is outlandish, their speech unintelligible, and their ways and manners wholly foreign to this country. With friends like that, So these new immigrants came, they established their own Orthodox congregations and Zionist, socialist, and Yiddishist organizations as well. Like many Southern Jews before them, they often worked as peddlers or merchants. Many of them sold to a Black clientele in towns and especially in urban neighborhoods of the industrializing New South. Their wealthier co-religionists worked to kind of acculturate them into white Southern Moors, and they themselves in different ways kind of sought the accoutrements of Southern whiteness. One of my favorite examples of this is, there's a great book about the Jewish orphan asylum in Atlanta, which would give stipends to, widowed mothers to care for their children. And there was all sorts of fights because these poor widowed mothers wanted to use the stipend to pay for a Black domestic worker. And the sort of wealthy philanthropists didn't like that. They thought that they should, use the money in different ways. At the same time, as these Jews were sort of relating to whiteness, and there was also new forms of racial thinking in this period that added new racial categories to the mix: Anglo-Saxon, Teuton, Semite, etc. And this increasing sense of a Jewish difference that was racial in nature and not just religious was put on its most dramatic display in 1915. Oh, here's some of the Eastern European immigrants. This is a New Year's card from 1904. A store where you see white merchants and Black employees in Charleston. So all of this sort of new racial thinking sort of comes to a head in 1915 when a white Jewish man named Leo Frank is lynched in Marietta, Georgia. Frank had been convicted of murdering a young white female employee named Mary Fagan, and he was sentenced to death. Although after a national outcry, the governor of Georgia commuted his sentence to life in prison. And once his sentence was commuted, that's when a mob came, dragged him from the prison, took him to Marietta, and lynched him. Lynching was widespread in Georgia and in other southern states. Over 20 African Americans were lynched in Georgia in 1915 alone, and there was a Black man lynched on the very same day as Leo Frank in another part of the state. But Frank's lynching followed 2 years of national publicity, of virulent anti-Semitic coverage in Georgia. And those who witnessed the lynching described it as like some religious rite with a curiously reverent manner. It seemed different in certain ways. Those who orchestrated the lynching were among those who would revive the Ku Klux Klan soon after at nearby Stone Mountain. Frank's lynching also led to the establishment of the Anti-Defamation League. So it's a significant moment in a number of ways. Frank himself was born in Texas and then spent most of his life in New York before moving to Atlanta. He was a fluent English speaker. He was a member of Atlanta's venerable Reform synagogue, the Temple. And yet, in this case, none of that really seemed to matter. Mary Fagan, the girl who had been murdered, her minister later suggested that in this case, a Black perpetrator would have been an unsatisfying suspect. He wrote, "A Yankee Jew here would be a victim worthy to pay for the crime." And it's worth noting that the Frank lynching kind of loomed over Southern Jews, especially Atlanta Jews, for quite a while afterward. And it can be seen in some ways as framing what happens in the sort of next era that I'm going to talk about, which is the era of the civil rights movement. So historians speak now about a long civil rights movement, and the very first kind of inklings that desegregation would be legally mandated by the federal government came in 1948 when President Truman desegregated the military. In 1950, as the cases that would be consolidated as Brown v. Board of Education began to make their way through the courts, the issue was discussed in South Carolina among members of the Jewish Fraternal Order B'nai B'rith. And this is really interesting, I think. So one of these leaders, Henry Yashik, who the Jewish Studies program in Charleston is the Yashik Arnold Jewish Studies program. So Henry Yashik, he's predicting in 1950, there will be no violence attendant upon the Supreme Court decision. Persons of any faith will be respected more if they fight for decency, and we can take only one side, the humanitarian side. So I think this is a kind of a fascinating moment in 1950, this liminal moment between 1948 when the military is desegregated and 1954 when you have Brown v. Board. Desegregation's future was uncertain, and at least some Southern Jews expressed their support for desegregation and even optimism about what its course would be in the region. Of course, Yashik could not be more wrong, wildly wrong, totally wrong. Following Brown v. Board, there was massive resistance to desegregation and threats, including violent threats and violent actions towards those who supported it. There were Southern Jews who were amongst those resisting desegregation. This is a Jewish view on segregation published by the Association of Citizens Councils in Greenwood, Mississippi. The Citizens Councils were these groups of white defenders of segregation. It is interesting, though, that this was written anonymously, where they had other pamphlets, including a Christian view on segregation that was not anonymous. So it shows perhaps some concern about reception amongst his co-religionists, perhaps, unclear. So yeah, there were those who resisted it. Most seem to have been fearful or ambivalent. A common move was to claim that Black civil rights was an American issue, was a Christian issue, was not a Jewish issue. There were others, though, Reform rabbis especially, like Jacob Rothschild in Atlanta, Burton Podol in Charleston, and Perry Nussbaum in Jackson, who were insistent on defending the rights of their neighbors, arguing that it was, in fact, a Jewish issue. So Perry Nussbaum, I want to talk about him for a minute. Harry Nussbaum was a Reform rabbi born in Toronto. He arrived in Jackson in the mid-1950s. It was a Jewish community with roots in the antebellum period. It was the largest in Mississippi by this time. Nussbaum became involved in civil rights in 1961 when he began visiting freedom riders, Jewish freedom riders who had been imprisoned at Parchman Prison. That was controversial among his rabbinic colleagues, but he saw those Jewish youths as part of his sort of flock. And in 1967, after he continued to be involved in civil rights activism, both his synagogue and his home were bombed. There had been an earlier spate of bombings of Southern Jewish institutions in the late 1950s by white supremacists. And there were two young Northern Jewish organizers, Michael Schwerner and Andrew Goodman, who were murdered in Mississippi in 1964, along with their Black coworker, James Chaney. So then in 1968, this was a letter I found in the archives that doesn't directly appear in the book, but I think speaks to some issues that are really important. In 1968, almost exactly a year to the date after his synagogue was bombed, he writes a letter to leaders of the Reform movement asking a formal rabbinic question, a shaila. He's asking for a rabbinic response. And he's asking about a situation he's dealing with in his congregation. What would you recommend should be my rabbinical position on the proposal of a Jewish male married to a Black woman converted to Judaism to join my congregation in the event the Board of Trustees rejects it? So there's an interracial Jewish couple who might try to join his congregation. He's afraid that the congregational leaders are gonna say no. So that's what's going on. I do have the responses. There was 10 rabbis who he wrote to, and all of them responded. And they all, basically, they all agree that she should be admitted, that this couple should be welcomed. Right, a Jew is a Jew. Skin color is not relevant. But they also, and they also, some of them kind of mention their own experiences with other Black converts to Judaism, including the rabbi in Dallas is the only Southern rabbi that he writes to, and he mentions a Black convert within his congregation, and other rabbis also mention. So I think that this is sort of a part of a small and under-recognized kind of pioneering generation of Black Jews trying to enter into predominantly white synagogues. All of his, and I think what's fascinating about this to me is that this brought the civil rights movement and the question of integration directly into the synagogue. Right, I said previously, talking about other issues, Jews could say, it's not a Jewish question, it's an American question, it's a Christian question. This brought it sort of into the heart of American Judaism, the heart of these Southern Jewish communities, and made it unquestionably a question of Jewish religious life. This was not a controversial question in terms of Jewish law, but all of his respondents said that they understood that he was in a vulnerable position and that it might be dangerous to do the right thing. As one rabbi wrote Nussbaum, "It's easy enough for me in Boston. I'm afraid, however, that won't help much in facing the practical complications in Mississippi." So it's this fascinating moment for showing the sort of presence of Black Jews within these communities and the sort of the struggle of these rabbis in Nussbaum in particular, right, in the wake of trauma, struggling to sort of fulfill the dictates of his conscience. So the name of the book is The Jewish South, and I chose it for a number of reasons. First, there's two different newspapers in the late 19th century that bore this name. I love old newspapers, love old mastheads, they're beautiful. And these newspapers built on and created a sense that there was a distinct public community and network of people who had something in common, right? They sort of asserted the presence and demonstrated the presence of a Jewish South. And this emergence of a Southern Jewish identity is one important facet of the book. This kind of sense of a Jewish South was also reinforced by other institutions. There was a short-lived Southern Conference of American Rabbis. There were Southern districts of the Jewish Fraternal Order B'nai B'rith, each of which sponsored their own orphanage. There was one in New Orleans, one in Atlanta. The Jewish South was also defined by moments when Southern Jews distinguished themselves or were distinguished from their Northern co-religionists. Certainly the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement, but also other moments elements. For instance, a series of Southern yellow fever epidemics in the 1870s when Northern Jews kind of came together to help our benighted Southern brethren. So in naming the book, I wanted to invoke this sense of identity, and also, as I hope you've gathered in today's talk, to expand it somewhat to allow for a more complex vision of kind of who is part of the Jewish South. I think the title also invites us to think about the South as a region through Jewish eyes. It shows that contrary to popular stereotypes, this region has always had elements that were urban, globally oriented, multilingual, multi-religious. That history has always coexisted with an undercurrent of suspicion of forms of difference, which were, of course, racial, but also religious. Jews often felt different in ways that were shaped by their distinct religious practices and identities. And I think they help us see the sort of pervasiveness of Protestant Christianity in kind of the bones of the region. To return to Cash, I think Jews retained forms of distinctiveness and experienced discrimination, but they did not, quote, refuse to be assimilated, and they were not, quote, eternal aliens. Ultimately, I see this as a story of ambivalent and contingent belonging, and the ways that people cope with a kind of simultaneous insiderhood and outsiderhood. The subtitle of the book is An American History. That's because I think that these are stories that all Americans would benefit from learning about and sitting with. I also don't think the South is utterly distinctive or unique. I think it is in many ways like the rest of the country, only more so. It shows in stark relief the broader American trends, especially the perennial struggle to achieve peace, equality, and diversity all at once. Thank you.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. And I assume you're willing to answer.
Yes, very happy to take questions.
So I will come around with the microphone and I'll try to keep track of whose hand is up.
Thank you. Two questions, but one simple. The picture on the book, what does that represent? And can you comment on the Lehman family? And if I understand history correctly, they were maybe the main financial supporter of the Confederacy during the Civil War.
So this image on the cover is the historic synagogue in Savannah. My Charleston friends, like the rabbi at the synagogue in Charleston, made a joke that she was offended that Savannah made the cover instead of Charleston, given my close ties there. It comes from a postcard. There's a lot of beautiful postcards of synagogues from throughout the region. There's a website project called Synagogues of the South, which collects all these postcards, and you can Google Synagogues of the South and look at those. Yeah, the Lehmans, I don't dig into them in particular a tremendous amount. This is a very broad spanning book, and I tried to get like unexpected characters as much as expected folks. They're one of a number of Jewish peddlers and merchants who kind of came out of the antebellum South and went on to sort of fame and fortune. There's other families like the Seligmans, the Ox family that now owns the New York Times. So there were, Jewish families that made their way through and went on to leave the region and to make a larger imprint. There were Jews who were involved in providing funds to the Confederacy. For instance, the guy I mentioned before who wrote a letter to Johnson saying, "What can I say? I liked secession." He donated at the very, very beginning, right after Fort Sumter. He donated like $10,000. So yes, there were Jews who were involved in that, but I don't know a lot about the Lehman case in particular.
Let's see if this works. Okay. I remember my parents in the Midwest feeling okay, so yeah, I remember my parents in the Midwest being afraid to travel to many areas of the South as Jewish people. And I'm just curious, was there a different view in the South of Jewish people coming down from the North, or did Jewish people in the South feel worried about the fact that they were Jewish?
they were worried and kind of resentful. And yeah, there's interesting dynamics in the 50s and 60s of Southern Jews feeling like Northern Jews were just kind of like swooping in and like, you know, looking down on them and making assumptions and like causing trouble and attracting attention. So yeah, absolutely, there was like suspicion, fear, and even anger at Northern Jews and Northern Jewish organizations like the ADL that were like making statements that they you know, indicated were for all American Jews, right? Like we're saying that like we support desegregation, and Southern Jews were, you know, feeling vulnerable because of that. And even Perry Nussbaum actually. The Union of American Hebrew Congregations invited Martin Luther King Jr. to speak at their annual meeting, and even Perry Nussbaum was like, "This choice is dangerous for my congregants and myself." And you know, he was a civil rights activist, but was very concerned about like what these Jews from outside were doing and what the implications would be for their own communities. I want to say if any students have questions too, don't be shy. Very much invited.
I'm older than my student ages, unfortunately, but student of life. But I really appreciated this talk, and I was really interested in this like tension between like assimilation versus like preserving Jewish heritage. And one thing I was curious about back in the day, there was a lot of like taboo against interfaith marriage, both from Jews and from like Christians. And there wasn't J-date. How did people like meet each other, especially if they were in small communities where there wouldn't be a lot of Jewish people? How did they meet and develop families?
So yeah, great question. They, you know, there were Jewish business and family networks that were kind of used to make these kinds of matches. So you actually see quite a few like, you know, Charleston, Savannah marriages, you know, the Savannah, Charleston, Savannah, like, you know, various places in the Caribbean. Yeah, I mean, and some communities are big enough. You see some in like the antebellum period. You see some like immigrant Jews like going back to the old country to like bring a partner back, and you do see intermarriage pretty early on. Pretty early on, something I found in the research for my first book is that there actually were cases of Jewish men marrying Christian women in 19th century America and essentially like asserting their children's Jewish identity, like, and asserting the patrilineal descent, which is goes contrary to like centuries of Jewish law and predicted what the reform movement would officially do in 1983, right? So like, and that's, you know, I think I especially focused that on the first book, but you see that in this book too. There are challenges to establishing Jewish life in new places, and so there's a lot of like adaptation and creativity, and that's one of the ways that you see it. There's a rabbi in New Orleans in like the early 1860s, and New Orleans had a lot of intermarriage. Like their synagogue basically allowed intermarried members, which was pretty radical. But they sort of, you know, if they didn't, they wouldn't have any members. They were already in like the 1830s, I think they were allowing that. But there was a rabbi in New Orleans who, in 1862, like the Civil War is fully on, and he like writes a screed against circumcisers who were circumcising the children of Jewish men and Christian women. And like that's what he's focusing on. He's like mad about the like extra circumcisions that like might give people the wrong impression, you know. So it was a concern of rabbis, but one of the things about American life is that rabbis don't have that much power. So people do what they're going to do, and intermarriage present throughout the history of the region. Mm-hmm.
Did you dig into the differences of the Jewish experience between the coastal South and sort of the deep South, or the difference between Jews in southern cities versus Jews in more rural areas, and what the differences of their experiences were?
Yeah, not in a super systematic way, but I tried, right? It's an ambitious thing to say you're gonna write like the whole region. And I tried to like have materials from a lot of different kinds of communities. The urban experience is absolutely important, and Charleston is important for me because it's, you know, a continuous community since the 18th century. So I kind of go back to Charleston repeatedly, but also, you know, in the 20th century, I found the records of an obscure Reform rabbi who like hopped around small community to small community. He was, you know, in Sumter, South Carolina. He was in, I think, Monroe, Louisiana, right? So looked a little bit at the small town experience as well. So yeah, I try to include a diverse amount of diverse Jewish experiences and attend to those differences, but I didn't sort of systematically look at it. And of course, yes, like, you know, Charleston is different from New Orleans, and different Jewish communities kind of develop at different times for different reasons, and sort of take on different characters because of that. So actually, I was talking before about the two Jewish politicians who both supported the Union of American Hebrew Congregations. One was a Democrat and one was a Republican. And I tried to figure out sort of how did they end up on different sides of this like fierce political debate. And one of the contributing factors is that the Democrat lived in Alexandria, Louisiana, which was like very heavily impacted by the Civil War, was a very old community. And the Republican lived in Little Rock, which hadn't been as affected by the war and was much more sort of a new and modernizing city. So they were kind of shaped by the ethos of the cities that they lived in, as well as other factors. That's not an amazing answer to your question, but it's an important note just to recognize that, you know, there's no one uniform experience. There's a lot of different sort of kinds of Jewish experiences shaped by the different places people lived and the different industries and histories of different places.
I wanted to answer that fellow's question. Said, how did Jews hook up? How did they meet? Because my dad was a shrimp inspector. My Jewish father from New Haven was a shrimp inspector after the war in Houma, Louisiana. And if you know anything about Louisiana geography, that's as far in the boondocks as you can get. And so he's walking down the street in Houma, his first day there, and somebody's Judar tunes into him, and they come out of their shop and they say, "Have I got a girl for you?" So that's how it happened too.
Active recruitment.
And I did want to ask a question,
Sure.
which was that what was the outcome of the miscegenation in Jackson with the white Jewish guy and his black Jewish wife?
Yeah, I actually was not able to find out, and I tried so the records of the congregation are held by the Institute for Southern Jewish Life in Jackson. They looked through the records. They say the records were tampered with before they were deposited there. They asked some older members of the congregation, and nobody remembered. I have a piece coming out that sort of analyzes these letters. It's going to be in the journal Southern Jewish History, and you know, without being able to figure out who this couple was, I tried to figure out sort of what might their experience have been. And so I talked in that piece about Melvin Leventhal and Alice Walker, who were black, white. He was Jewish and white, she was black and non-Jewish, and they were living in Jackson at this exact same time. So I got his email address and I emailed Melvin Leventhal and said, like, do you know who this couple was? Did you like know of another interracial Jewish couple in town? And he didn't know either. So I've made some attempts. I don't know what happened. My guess is that they moved right along, that they didn't push it, that they felt the sort of lack of welcome and, you know, moved elsewhere, just disaffiliated. That's my best guess, and I, you know, can't really blame them.
On the lynching of Leo Frank, I'm just curious. Did they? I mean, obviously the court thought he did it, but I'm wondering if the Jewish community at the time thought he did it, and like if, because oftentimes like in the Black community, they would really fight for people who they thought were being falsely accused of crimes like that. So I'm just wondering how the reaction of the Jewish community of Atlanta was.
Yeah, the Jewish community absolutely believed he was innocent, fought for him, and actually like mobilized this national campaign. There was like wealthy Jewish philanthropists in the North who were putting resources behind defending Leo Frank, which only kind of fueled anti-Semitic stereotypes and sentiments in the South, because they would say, oh, these like Northern, like rich Jews are coming down and trying to tell us what to do. So yeah, absolutely, they maintained his innocence. He was, at a certain point, like in recent decades, Frank was officially pardoned by the governor of Georgia. Anti-Semites on the internet still think that Leo Frank was guilty. The general scholarly consensus and Jewish communal consensus is that he was innocent. It's hard to solve a murder 110 years later, but the evidence, I'll just say that the evidence was not ironclad against him.
Yeah, thank you. This was so great. I'm wondering if you can talk like briefly about, for those of us in here who are educators, how to better incorporate the Jewish South into like intro to Jewish studies classes, intro to American Jewish classes, and even like intro to religion classes.
Thank
Or
you. Yeah,
American religion.
that's a good question. I think there's a lot of different ways to go about it. I think in some ways, if you wanted to teach an American Jewish history class that was subversive, you would just assign this book and say, because I think a lot of the big American Jewish history books were regional histories of the Northeast without being upfront about it. So you could, assign this book and then bring in primary sources from other regions and articles about, the similar time periods in other regions and try to like draw those connections. I think, my feeling about the sort of lessons of this book for American Jewish historians is that it does kind of highlight these themes of violence and race that, are easier to get submerged when you're focusing on a Northern storyline. So I think I hope it gets to American Jewish history classrooms and religious studies classrooms. I think especially the early part on the chapter on the fundamental constitutions of Carolina. That's really part of an important moment in the sort of articulation of religion as a distinct category for understanding human difference. And so I think that would sort of pair well with other scholarship on the sort of emergence of religion and race as distinct and separable categories in this period.
Great. I think we have time for a couple more questions.
Shari, I just want to thank you for this book. I mean, I have a lot of students who've taken my Jewish South seminar. They're here. Don't we all want to thank her? Yes. Because there's not been that textbook. And it's always been, the books on American Jewish history, which of course are really Jonathan Sarna and they're so central. But to have a text that, is sitting in our classroom that says the Jewish South on it, I've bought like 50 copies. I send it to everybody because, it's like this, supports and shows that this is such a critical study. And like Julia's question about how to think about this, it's just like you can't teach American Jewish history without talking about the South and about the Southern Jewish experience. It's so critical. It's such an important example. And I just wanted to shamelessly promote that Shari and I did an interview with Shari about her work in the online journal Salvation South. And it's just out today. So look at salvationsouth.com and you'll see this interview where Shari talks about some really amazing things that she found. But I wanted to ask you one more question, which is, with your time at the College of Charleston, directing the Jewish Studies program there, your book has to stop in about 1967, because it's like a whole nother volume, which I'm sure one of our rising graduate students will write someday. But what issues like did you see, and do you even see from where you are in Oberlin and now traveling, that in the contemporary Jewish South that you think are part of, that are making history kind of right now, that you would want to talk about that's happening maybe in this region, but, in your region, what are those?
Yeah, I had an interesting conversation. My book launch was in Atlanta with the great historian Eric Goldstein, and he was asking me about this question of why stop in '67, and he was trying to push me to say he was like it's totally different. Like there maybe isn't even a Jewish South anymore, like after the 1970s, and I was like, well, I don't want to say that. I think there are consistent themes. I think migration is kind of a constant, and so the contemporary Southern Jewish community is shaped by migration from South Africa and Israel and the Soviet Union and Cuba, and continuing migration from the north. Jews are always coming south from the north, always, always, always. Like it's constantly happening. I also think the piece I talked about with the Jewish political dissent and debate and division, I think is a topic that has continued relevance for our time, and I think it's helpful to remember these histories of division and disagreement as not an aberration that just happened 2 years ago, but that's part of the history. So that's two things that I'll mention. But yeah, I just felt like there wasn't enough secondary source material that I could build on in order to really do proper justice to the rest of the history. And so I look forward to others doing some of that spade work.
Hi. I was wondering if you could speak to growing up here. There's like a dominant narrative that of Jews in the South as being staunchly opposed to segregation and actually romanticizes Jews in the South as civil rights activists, but seems to pretty egregiously ignore and bury our history and participation in white supremacy in the South. And I'm wondering where you saw this play out in your research, and in what ways do you think that bearing this past in our history was potentially intentional, or do you see this as something that happened after the 20th century as opposed to something that happened, um, you know, at the time? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that always comes up when I talk about the book is right, and also this is maybe has to do with the typical histories that focus on the North, because if you're looking at the civil rights movement and Jewish participation and your focus is on the North, you're like, we've got Abraham Joshua Heschel marching at Selma, but if you look at Southern Jewish communities, you see Jews in Selma who were friends with the police who were brutalizing protesters, right? So I really wanted this history to be readable and accessible, but not to sugarcoat or romanticize. I think it's really important. You can point to Abraham Joshua Heschel, but you also need to point to someone like a Solomon Blatt from South Carolina, who was the Speaker of the House of Representatives there, who basically said there's no racism in South Carolina. South Carolina is like a tolerant utopia, and look at me, I'm a Jewish person who's in a high political office, so I'm proof that there's no problems here, right? So it's that sort of romanticization is something that I definitely want to challenge, and that I think really digging into the sources from this period forces you to look at some ugly and painful things, but Jews were Southerners like other Southerners and could do some ugly things. And, it's always, the other piece is it's always hard to know, to what extent were they just fully acculturated as white Southerners? And so they did what other white Southerners did. To what extent did they feel the gaze of their Christian neighbors and feel, the threat of discrimination or exclusion? And did that shape their behavior and opinions? It's hard to know for sure, but we can sort of look at how people spoke and how they acted, and it was not always in ways that Southern Jews today would want to point to as role models. Yeah. No, but that is a true statement. In Chapel Hill? Oh, in Charleston. Oh, yes, in Charleston, right. They erected, after 2020, they have a plaque that acknowledges the enslaved workers who built the synagogue, which is the second oldest synagogue building in the US and was built in 1840. And if you're building a building in Charleston in 1840, there's enslaved laborers involved. And so, yeah, they have commemorated that and have tried to reckon with that past, which I think is admirable.
I think the quantity and quality of the questions reflect how engaging and fantastic this talk was. So please join me in thanking our speaker once more.
Thank you. My pleasure.